Welcome to Truth in Christ, everyone. I am so glad that you could join me for another great message. Today, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We are going to be showing you a chart of the seven seals of Revelation and the trumpets and the vials of wrath, and show you the correlation between some of these things, iron out some misconceptions about the chronology, and also fix some misconceptions about the plagues of the tribulation. And we will be showing you that the plagues are actually God's vengeance against those who persecute the church. I'm hoping these charts will fix misconceptions caused by modern dispensational teachings. But before we continue, I would like to ask you, if you haven't already, go ahead and click that subscribe button down below, turn on the notification bell, and set it to all so you can stay up to date on all my latest videos. Like, share, comment. Every interaction with this channel will help this channel out and help us with the YouTube algorithms and spread the gospel of God around the globe. Thank you very much, and I appreciate you for all your support. Now, I'm going to start with the seven seals of Revelation, which will lead into the trumpets and the vials of wrath. Now, when we look at the chronology of Revelation, it is not one continuous chronology. I always tell people it has a repetitive chronology. For instance, if you look at the seals of Revelation, it will play up to the coming of Christ, and then it starts over with the trumpets on the seventh seal, leading up to the coming of Christ, and then you see it also pick up on the vials of wrath, and lead up to the coming of Christ. Much like the book of Daniel, when you look at Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar's dream about the great statue tells us about the successions of kingdoms leading up to the coming of Christ. And then you look at the beasts in Daniel's dream. It is the exact same thing. The beast represents succession of kingdoms leading up to the coming of Christ. There was this repetitive chronology telling the same story, but with different details, leading up to and ending with the coming of Christ. And the chronology in Revelation works exactly the same way. So now let's look at the chart. Now, when we look at this chart, I want you to notice that the first six seals are the overview of things to come leading up to the coming of Christ. Now, this starts with the four horsemen of the apocalypse. The first horseman rides a white horse. He's going out conquering and to conquer. This is the Antichrist. Now, a lot of people are very contentious over this because they want this to be Jesus of Nazareth, hoping to prove some kind of rapture before the tribulation. However, if you look at how this is worded, he is going out conquering and to conquer. If you look at Daniel, the 11th chapter, the 20th verse through the 45th verse, I'll just give you an overview. The Antichrist is where the problems begin because he starts with a small group of people. He is not in line for the kingdom. He receives it through flattery and deceit. And after he finally gains enough power, he goes out on conquest and he sets his eyes on Israel. And he continues until he is defeated. And you go into Daniel, the 12th chapter, it tells a little bit about that tribulation when Michael the archangel would stand up for his people. And then it tells after that time of trouble, after that tribulation, that there would be a resurrection. If you read 2 Thessalonians, the 2nd chapter, it also tells us that the coming of Christ and our gathering unto him, 2 Thessalonians, the 1st chapter, the 1st through 3rd verse, if you read that, it tells us that the coming of Christ and our gathering to him, that's the resurrection and the rapture, says that day cannot happen until first there is a falling away and the man of sin is revealed. So scripturally, there is no way that this can be Jesus. This has to be the Antichrist because the coming of Christ and our gathering to him cannot happen until the Antichrist is revealed. Now, I did do a whole video on that, so if you want to watch that video, I left a link in the description box down below. So far, I have done a video on the first three seals of Revelation. If you want to watch those videos, I will leave a link in the description box down below. Now, if the Antichrist is going out, conquering and to conquer, you gotta look at this. This is kind of like cause and effect. The Antichrist shows up. The next horseman is war. Remember, the Antichrist shows up conquering and to conquer, and then obviously the next thing would be war. Now, wars do cause famine, and then you go into the fourth seal, and war and famine cause death. So you've got to look at these as cause and effect. The Antichrist goes out conquering and to conquer, and that is war. Wars cause famine. War and famine cause death. And a lot of people make the mistake of looking at each one of these seals as a year, and this only happens within that year. That is not the way to look at it, because you've got to think the Antichrist doesn't stop. It's not year one, the Antichrist shows up and then stop. And then year two, war happens, and then the war stops on year three. And then famine happens on that third year, and then that stops at the fourth year with death in Hades. That doesn't make any sense. In fact, when you look at the fourth seal of Revelation, the pale horse has a direct correlation back to war and famine. So you got to look at these things as things that will be continuous throughout the course of the tribulation. The war isn't going to stop until it's over. The Antichrist is going to be there throughout the tribulation. War, famine, and death. These things are going to continuously happen throughout the tribulation. And all these will be affected by different things. Now, when we get up to the fifth seal, this is where things begin to get really interesting, and the narrative of the modern dispensational teachings begin to crumble. Let's look at this fifth seal, where the martyred saints are crying out to God, asking God, how long will God allow this to happen to them? And then God gives them white robes and tells them to sleep a little while longer, until the number of their brothers that should be killed will be finished. God gives them comfort and tells them, yeah, it will stop, but it has to reach a certain point before it stops. In other words, it's like he's telling them to have patience, go back to sleep. But he's reminding them that there will be a limit. And so they know that there will be justice. God will avenge them. We also see in Revelation, the 13th chapter, the 6th through 7th verse, and Daniel, the 7th chapter, the 21st verse, and Daniel, the 7th chapter, and the 25th verse, that the beast will make war with the saints and overcome them, and he will wear out the saints, and that he will speak blasphemies against God. So there is massive persecution of the church. Now remember, there hasn't even been a resurrection or a rapture yet. This has to be the church because, as I said, according to 2 Thessalonians, the 2nd chapter, the 1st through 3rd verse, the rapture cannot happen until the Antichrist is revealed. I don't care what a dispensational teacher will try to tell you about the 7th verse. They are incorrectly interpreting that verse, isolating it by itself, and ignoring the premise and the context set in the first 3 verses. I also did a video on that, and I will leave a link in the description box down below so you can check that video out as well. But I want you to notice something, that during this persecution, the prayers of the saints go up, and the plagues begin after the prayers of the saints go up. In Revelation, the 8th chapter, the 2nd through 6th verse, we will go into that a little deeper later on in this video. I have a different chart to show you for that one. But if in Revelation, the 8th chapter, the 2nd through the 6th verse, which is the 7th seal of Revelation, the 7 trumpets, it says that the prayers go up. Now, what's interesting about this is that in the 6th seal, that is the second coming of Christ. If you look at Revelation, the 6th chapter, the 12th through the 17th verse, you cross-reference that with Joel, the 2nd chapter, the 31st through 32nd verse, Isaiah, the 2nd chapter, the 2nd verse through the 21st verse, you're going to find a lot of correlations between these verses. Everything from the cosmic signs in heaven about the second coming in Joel, even into Isaiah, when the enemies of God try to hide themselves from his coming. This is the wrath of the Lamb, the second coming of Christ. Even when you read on down in Revelation, the 7th chapter, the 1st through 8th verse. This is still the 6th seal. The 144,000 are revealed. But then we look at Revelation, the 7th chapter, the 9th through the 17th verse, and then we notice that the saints who lived through the tribulation enter God's kingdom. So the 6th seal is the second coming, which means then the 7th seal is starting the chronology all over again. If we look down at the plagues and the 7 trumpets, they lead up to the coming of Christ, and this is in Revelation chapters 8 through 11. We look at the 7 vials of wrath, or bowls of wrath, according to some translations. The 7 vials of wrath lead up to the coming of Christ in Revelation chapters 15 through 16. So we know that the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls of wrath are repeats, ending with the second coming of Christ, which means the events mentioned in the 7th seal will happen somewhere between the 5th and 6th seal. And why do I say that? Because the persecution and the martyrdom of the saints is mentioned in the 5th seal. And as we will see later on in Revelation, the 8th chapter, the 2nd through 6th verse, the prayers of the saints go up, and then the plagues begin. And as you will see later on in the next chart, these plagues are not to punish the saints, as dispensational teachers try to say, as they try to create an entirely new fictitious group called the tribulation saints, which they prejudice all of Christianity against as some kind of second-class Christian who will not only face the Antichrist, but suffer at the hands of an unmerciful God who will keep punishing them with plagues even after they repent. But let's look at that again. The 5th seal is persecution. And then we look at the 6th seal, the second coming of Christ, where it's the wrath of the Lamb, and the enemies of Christ hide themselves, and the saints who went through the great tribulation get to dwell with God forever. That's the second coming and the resurrection. What does it say in Revelation, the 20th chapter? It talks about those who were beheaded for their testimony of Jesus Christ, and that they rejected the Antichrist. They did not receive the mark of the beast. They would not worship the beast or his image. And it says that these people were in what was called the first resurrection. The first few verses in Revelation, the 20th chapter, just described the events mentioned in the 5th and the 6th seal. So in the 7th seal, we see the chronology start all over again. Now, this next chart is going to be very interesting because it is actually going to show that the plagues are not punishment against the saints, but it is actually punishment against the ungodly and the Antichrist kingdom. And we will actually see that the prayers of the saints unleash the plagues of tribulation as God avenges the church. Now, I know this chart is a lot of text, but I really wanted to lay these out in parallel where you can actually see the correlation between these things. And that's the reason for this format. Now, if we look at Revelation, the 8th chapter, the 1st through 6th verse, let's look at some things here. It says, "And when he had opened the 7th seal," now the 7th seal is the 7 trumpets, "there was silence in heaven about the space of a half hour. And I saw the 7 angels which stood before God, and to them were given trumpets. And another angel came and stood at the altar." Now I want you to notice they are at the altar. It says, "having a golden censer, and there was given unto him much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne." So the prayers of the saints go up with the smoke of the incense. And the 4th verse is, "and the smoke of the incense which came with the prayers of the saints ascended up before God." So now the prayers of the saints are going up to God. and out of the angel's hand, and the angel took the censer. Now notice that. The angel took the censer and filled it with the fire of the altar and cast it into the earth. And there were voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. And the 7 angels which had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. So the angels only prepared themselves to sound after the prayers of the saints go up to God, and we see that the fire from the altar is cast to the earth, and that is when the angels have prepared to sound. Now, if we go into that first trumpet, look at this. Hail and fire mingled with blood. That is the first plague mentioned with the trumpets, that there was hail and fire mingled with blood. It says they were cast upon the earth. Now we go back to that in the first 6 verses. What did it say? It said that the angel took the censer and filled it with the fire of the altar and cast it into the earth. And then we see fire mingled with blood headed towards the earth. That's the first trumpet. Remember, the angels were preparing themselves to sound when this fire was cast down. So as this fire reaches earth, the first trumpet sounds. Then the second trumpet is just like it. It says, as it were, a great mountain burning with fire was cast. Look at that. It was cast into the sea. So the fire from the altar is cast into the earth, and we see fire hitting the earth. We see fire hitting the sea. And it says that they were cast into the earth. They were cast into the sea. It's not coincidence that when the prayers went up with the smoke of the incense, that the fire from that altar from which the prayers and the incense was offered, that this fire would be used and the angel would cast it to the earth. And then the first couple of plagues is mentioning fire cast into the earth and into the sea. But I want you to notice something. Not one single plague started until the prayers of the saints went up. And that is when the fire comes down and the trumpets sound. Isn't it amazing that the fire used to offer up the incense and the prayers of the saint was the very same fire from the very same altar that those things were offered up on? That was what was cast into the earth. So I think it's very clear, just by what we're reading here, that the prayers of the saints trigger the plagues of Revelation. But now, if we look at the trumpets and the vials of wrath in parallel, as I said before, the first trumpet was hail and fire mingled with blood, and it was cast to the earth. The third part of the trees was burned up. But now, the first vial, it wouldn't appear that there was any direct correlation between the first trumpet and the first vial. We look at this, it says in Revelation, the 16th chapter, the 2nd verses, there fell a noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast, and upon them which worshipped his image. Now notice who the plagues are attacking here. Only the beast's people in his kingdom. Those are the people who are getting this plague, not the saints. Remember, the premise of modern dispensational teachings is that the tribulation saints will be left behind to suffer God's wrath. So far, they haven't suffered God's wrath. Now, you see, modern dispensational teachings demand that the saints are left behind, and that those saints are left behind to suffer the wrath of God. That is actually what they use to bully people into believing their doctrine. Oh, you don't want to be left behind and suffer God's wrath. This idea of a fictitious group known as the tribulation saints left behind to suffer God's wrath is some of the most unbiblical nonsense I've ever heard. Because we just read, it is the prayers of the saints that bring down these plagues on the ungodly. What did we see in the first vial of wrath? Was it against the tribulation saints? No, it was against all those who took the mark of the beast or who worshiped the beast in his image. Now, as I said, the first trumpet and the first vial of wrath don't appear to have any direct correlation with one another. But you will notice with the rest of the trumpets and the vials of wrath, you will start to notice that there are parallels between the rest of them. And as we continue to read, you will notice that the plagues only touch the ungodly and not the righteous. As we continue, when we look at the second trumpet and the second vial, the second trumpet says, as it were a great mountain burning with fire cast into the sea, and a third part of the sea became blood, and a third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and a third part of the ships were destroyed. And then when we look at the second vial that is poured upon the sea, now notice that the second trumpet is affecting the sea and turning the water to blood. The second vial is doing the exact same thing. It's poured out upon the sea, and it becomes the blood of dead men, and every living soul died in the sea. So we see a direct parallel between these two. Then we look at the third trumpet. It says, there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon a third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters, and the name of the star is called Wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. So the water is contaminated, it is bitter, it was upon the rivers and the fountains of waters. Vial 3 is also poured upon the rivers and the fountains of waters, that they became as blood. Both the trumpets and these vials are leading up to the coming of Christ, and they're just telling another half of the same plague, excluding trumpet 1 and vial 1, which are separate plagues from one another. But considering that the rest of the trumpets and vials, each telling a different side of the same plague, it would then lead us to believe that trumpet 1 and vial 1 come upon the ungodly simultaneously. So in vial 3, Revelation, the 16th chapter, the 4th through 7th verse. Now I only hit the highlights for the sake of time and space on these charts, because these charts, I couldn't fit the entire passage in, so I only put in the highlights. So you can go back to that chapter and read what it says in its entirety. But when we look at this passage, I want you to notice who's being judged here. It says, and I heard the angels of the water say, look at this, thou hast judged thus. So this is God's judgment. For they have shed the blood of saints. Well, now, ain't that interesting? They've shed the blood of saints and prophets. Saints and prophets. And thou hast given them blood to drink, for they are worthy. So the ungodly people of the earth who have shed the blood of the saints and the prophets, who have persecuted the saints and the prophets, God has sent a judgment on them who have killed the saints. Now, I thought the entire premise of the left behind tribulation saint was that they were left behind to suffer the wrath of God, not to be avenged by it. That's what they continuously warn us about, that the left behind would suffer the wrath of God, that the left behind was all the unbelieving or the doubting, or those who just didn't believe in pre-tribulation rapture. They would be left behind to suffer the wrath of God. That's what they always warn us about, that the left behind, if you don't believe in pre-tribulation rapture, you will be left behind. You'll stay here. You can read countless books by countless people who will try to bully you into believing their doctrine, telling you you will be left behind and that you will suffer the wrath of God for not believing in their doctrine. But we're not even all the way through the plagues yet, and the only thing we've seen so far is that the plagues only punish the ungodly who have taken the mark or worshipped the beast or worshipped his image, and it is also avenged the blood of the saints and the prophets. That is completely different than the narrative that they try to sell you and try to bully you into believing. But I digress. But so far, what we've seen with trumpet 2 and vial 2 and trumpet 3 and vial 3, these are different sides of the same plague. We go into trumpet 4. It says a third part of the sun was smitten, and a third part of the moon, and a third part of the stars. So as the third part of them was darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise. We read in vial 4 that the fourth vial was poured out upon the sun, and power was given unto him to scorch men with fire. And men were scorched with great heat. And now look at this. It says, and they repented not to give him glory. And it also says that they blasphemed. What do we see in Trumpet 4 and Vial 4? Well, this actually looks like it would be some kind of fallout from the impacts of the fire that is falling from heaven. It hit earth, it hit the sea, it hit the rivers and the fountains of waters. So this actually sounds like some kind of debris or dust that is up in the air, probably from the impact of the fire that fell from heaven, that hit the earth, that hit the sea, that hit the fountains of waters, that hit the rivers. This sounds like those plagues threw dust up in the air, and then things begin to heat up. I do remember reading somewhere that if a big enough object from space was to hit Earth, it could actually cause the planet to heat up. This actually sounds like something was falling from the heavens, hitting the earth, dust was going up in the air, and the earth was heating up because this would cause a form of greenhouse effect. But what we've noticed here, this is targeting yet again the ungodly, but they don't repent. They blaspheme God. Now, some people might ask, well, now how is that helpful to the church? How is that punishing the ungodly and not the saints? Well, Scripture makes clear that it is directed towards the ungodly. And we do see that one of the plagues, the third vial, the third trumpet, is God's vengeance against those who shed the blood of the saints. And we do see that the plagues are triggered by the prayers of the saints. So here is the thing. The church is at a point where they have nothing left to lose. The church is being persecuted. They're being martyred. They're being killed. They're living in places where they can't buy or sell without the mark of the beast. And the moment that they are caught and they don't have the mark of the beast and won't take it, nor will they worship the image of the beast, nor will they worship the beast, they are killed for it. We also know that this is a time of apostasy, so Christians will be few and far in between. There will not be billions of believers in the world. Between the apostasy and the martyrdom, the numbers of Christian believers will dwindle. There will be people who will get offended, according to the sower parable. If you read that, people will get offended when tribulation and persecution arises, and they will leave the faith. That's an apostasy. Jesus says those who save their life will lose it, and those who will lose their life will save it. In other words, if you give in to the persecution, if someone is threatening you and you give in and you reject Christ and you worship another god, you lose your soul. Those who reject Christ cannot receive his grace. But we see that this is directed towards the ungodly. Their hearts are hardened. They start blaspheming God. We go to Trumpet 5 and Vial 5. In Trumpet 5 it says, the fallen angel that opens the bottomless pit, and smoke arose and locusts, and they were led by a demon by the name in the Hebrew tongue Abaddon, and in the Greek tongue Apollyon. They will be given the power of scorpions. They will be commanded not to hurt the vegetation. But the men without the seal of God in their foreheads, they will seek death and not find it. Again, directed towards the ungodly, not the righteous. Vial 5, we see that it says it's poured out upon the seat of the beast, and his kingdom was full of darkness. So this goes directly after the Antichrist kingdom. And after the Antichrist, it's upon his seat. It says, and they gnawed their tongues for pain and repented not of their deeds. And it says they blasphemed. So again, their hearts are hardened because of this plague, and they blasphemed. Now, we notice that in Trumpet 5, these are demons. And what it says about these demons, it says that they have the power of scorpions, that they're able to sting men. Now, they're commanded not to hurt the vegetation or anybody with the seal of God in their foreheads. Again, this is only against the ungodly, not against the righteous. It says that these people will seek death and not find it. What happens when a scorpion stings you? It is painful. And what does that venom do? It causes excruciating pain. But it says that they will seek death. They will not find it. This is not against the godly. This is against the unrighteous. It says that anyone that has the seal of God in their forehead, that these demons will not bother them. They will not touch them. But then again, in that next vial, when that is poured out upon the seat of the beast and his kingdom is full of darkness, it says, and they gnawed their tongues for the pain. We look at Trumpet 6 and Vial 6. It says 2 angels were loosed from the river Euphrates to slay a third part of men, which was a cavalry of 200,000. That's 200 million. They prepared for war. But as you read on down, to me, it sounds like modern military warfare, tanks, the modern soldier who carries his gun on his chest. So, blue smoke and fire looks like it would be coming from his chest. I personally believe that this looks like modern warfare. That's what I picture in my mind when I read this. Then it goes on to tell us that the survivors do not repent. Go into Vial 6. Again, poured upon the great river Euphrates. Trumpet 6 affects the river Euphrates. The 6th vial says that it was poured upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. And then it says, and he gathered them together into the place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon. So when these angels are loosed from the river Euphrates, this was about getting that military into Israel, getting them to Megiddo. Vial 6 makes it very clear that it was preparing the way of the kings of the east so that God could gather them together into the place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon. So this was just a way that God was able to get his enemies to muster their army at Armageddon. And this is a trap because when the Lord returns, they will fight against him and he will destroy the Antichrist. If we go into Trumpet 7 and Vial 7, if we look at Revelation, the 11th chapter, the 15th through 19th verse, we find that Christ returns. He takes control of the kingdoms. It's a time of judgment. It's a time that the saints are rewarded, but it is also the time of God's wrath. In the Greek tongue, the word here for wrath is orge. It is not to be confused with the vials of wrath. That's an entirely different Greek word. But the word here, orge, I've done a video on that, on the Greek word orge for God's wrath at the second coming. This is also the same word used for 1 Thessalonians, the 5th chapter, the 9th verse, that we are not appointed to God's wrath. I did a video on that and a study on the word orge, but throughout Revelation, the word orge is always used at the second coming of Christ. This is not the plagues. This is not the vials of wrath. These are two totally different things. This is when Christ comes back to destroy the Antichrist, his army, his allies, and to punish Babylon and to burn those who took the mark of the beast, who worshiped the beast and his image, and the beast and the false prophet, to take them all and to put them into the lake of fire burning with brimstone. And I'll leave a link in the description box down below if you're interested in that video and that study, and that will add a lot of context to the second coming of Christ. If we look at Vial 7, it says that this angel poured his vial into the air, and there came a great voice out of the temple of heaven from the throne saying, "It is done." So this is the end of the tribulation. It is over. It says, there were voices and thunderings and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake, and so great. And the great city was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell, and great Babylon came in remembrance before God to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. Again, there's that word orge. And it says, and there fell upon men great hail out of heaven, and men blasphemed God. Men began to blaspheme because of all the things that were happening as the wrath of God is poured out as Christ returns. Now, in this little red box down below, I added some notes here. If you want to dig deeper into this, the angel expands on the 7th vial in Revelation, the 17th chapter, and in Revelation, the 18th through 19th chapter. This expands on the fall of Babylon and the coming of Christ, and the wrath of God, and the marriage supper of the Lamb, where the saints of God return with Christ, and the birds of the air gather themselves together for the great supper that the Lord had prepared. And Revelation, the 19th chapter, the 15th verse says, out of his mouth, that's out of the mouth of Jesus, goes a sharp sword, that with it should smite the nations. And he shall rule them with a rod of iron, and he treadeth the winepress of the fierceness of the wrath of Almighty God. Now, if you notice, in the 7th vial of wrath, it talks about the fall of Babylon. You go into Revelation, the 18th chapter, it talks about the fall of Babylon and the coming of Christ. That's why I keep talking about repetitive chronology. When you look at the seals 1 through 6 talk about events leading up to the second coming of Christ. It starts over at the 7th seal with the 7 trumpets. It talks about the plagues leading up to the coming of Christ. And then we look at the 7 vials of wrath that lead up to the second coming of Christ. And if you look at Revelation, the 18th chapter through the 19th chapter, it talks about the fall of Babylon and the coming of Christ. So if you try to read Revelation chronologically from beginning to end, you have to ask yourself, how many times does Christ return and how many times does Babylon fall? But if you read that in a repetitive way, just like the book of Daniel, you will find that it reads much more clearly when you read Revelation as events leading up to the second coming of Christ, and then you identify where it picks up somewhere else leading up to the second coming of Christ, and again, at some other point, telling details that lead up to the second coming of Christ. And when you harmonize the seals, the trumpets, and the vials, you will find that they all tell different aspects and different parts leading up to the second coming of Christ. And then we find that the plagues do not punish the righteous. The plagues punish the ungodly, the unrepentant, those who took the mark of the beast, those who worship the beast, those who worship the image of the beast, and the seat of the beast. And we see that it is the prayers of the saints that lead up to these plagues being unleashed on the ungodly who persecuted the church. They persecuted the saints. They persecuted the prophets. They killed the righteous. We see in the 5th seal that the saints that have been martyred cry out to God, wanting God to do something about it. But we also see the narrative of somehow that there will be this left behind tribulation saint that will be there to suffer the wrath of God. We see that narrative completely crumble when we go to Revelation, the 8th chapter. The prayers of the saints are offered up with the incense of God, and the fire from the altar is cast to the earth, and the angels prepare themselves to sound after the prayers of the saints go up. And once that fire comes down, and then when we just look at the first 2 trumpets, we see fire being cast into the earth, the sea, and the rivers. And then we notice that the plagues target all the ungodly and not the righteous. You see, the plagues are not to punish the saints. The plagues is God's vengeance on behalf of the saints. It's time to dispense with the idea that God is somehow going to punish the saints through the tribulation, when we read that God is going to get vengeance against the ungodly because he loves his saints. And these plagues don't punish the righteous, but only the ungodly. I hope you enjoyed this message, found it informative and edifying. And as I said before, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button down below, turn on the notification bell, and set it to all. Like, share, comment. Every interaction with this channel is going to help this channel out with the YouTube algorithm and help us spread the gospel of God around the globe. God bless you, and I hope you have a wonderful day.